The other side of the road is safe, where we sidestep being bothered and avoid getting involved. But rolling up your sleeves and boldly going where few dare to tread, that's walking through Samaria. Each week on our podcast, we introduce you to the special few who walk in the spirit of the Good Samaritan. On behalf of the Giving Company and your hosts, David Hendrickson and Dan Riveros, welcome to the Walking Through Samaria podcast.
Well, hey, everybody. Welcome back to the Walking Through Samaria podcast. This is your host, David Hendrickson, with co-host
Dan Riveros.
Dan, how are you? We are still in COVID.
Yeah, man, just going through the waves of it, right? Just what a world.
We're going to do our normal disclaimer of there might be doorbells ringing, dogs barking, kids screaming. Anyway, all those things that happen when you're recording from home.
That's right. Who do we got today, David?
So I am very excited, Dan, to introduce to our listeners a good friend and just a legend, really, in Christian ministry and pastoral work. And frankly, in the area that we're going to be talking about today, racial unity and racial reconciliation. Dr. Tony Evans, welcome to the Walking Through Samaria podcast.
Nice.
Thank you. Glad that you are welcoming me. Glad to be with you.
Well, it's great to see you. Dr. Evans is also in his home in the Dallas, Texas area. I can vouch for him. I see him on this Zoom call that we're having right now, even though our listeners won't see his face on our podcast. I can vouch that it is the Dr. Evans coming at us from Dallas, Texas. Dan, I'm going to read for all of our listeners a little bit of information about Dr. Tony Evans. Now, many of our listeners probably don't need this. They may have been following the Urban Alternative on iDisciple, one of our platforms that features him. He's also got a huge radio ministry. But I am going to, for the listeners that may not know Dr. Evans, you're going to be very excited to hear about him and his background. There's a couple areas, Dan, where you're going to hear about Indiana University again, so just hang on.
All right.
So Dr. Evans has served as the senior pastor of Oak Cliff Bible Fellowship for over 40 years, witnessing its growth from 10 people in 1976 to now over 10,000 congregants with over 100 ministries. The first African-American to graduate with a doctoral degree from Dallas Theological Seminary. He served as an associate professor in the Pastoral Ministries Department in the areas of evangelism, homiletics, and Black church studies. He continues to serve Dallas Theological Seminary on the board of incorporate members. Dr. Evans holds the rare honor of serving as chaplain of the NBA's Dallas Mavericks over the last 3 decades. Dr. Evans, we're going to have to ask you about Mark Cuban, my fellow Indiana University graduate. He's the longest standing NBA chaplaincy on record. He's also the former chaplain of the Dallas Cowboys. That's probably been a little bit rough as of late, but he's the former chaplain there. Dr. Evans has authored over 100 books, booklets, and Bible studies, including his legacy work, Oneness Embraced, as well as his vision work, The Kingdom Agenda. Some of his most popular books include Kingdom Man, Kingdom Woman, Prayers for Victory in Spiritual Warfare, and The Power of God's Names. Dr. Evans holds the honor of writing and publishing the first full Bible commentary and study Bible by an African American. The reach of Dr. Evans' preaching spans the world, with his broadcasts airing on over 1,400 radio outlets in over 130 countries, reaching millions each and every week. Dr. Evans also serves as president of the Urban Alternative, a national ministry that seeks to restore hope and transform lives through the proclamation and application of the Word of God. His daily radio broadcast, The Alternative with Dr. Tony Evans, can also be heard as a podcast and on the Tony Evans app. Dr. Evans, again, welcome to the Walking Through Samaria podcast. We are so thrilled to have you.
I'm honored to be with you. Thank you for having me.
So, Dr. Evans, we usually sort of ease our way into some of these tough conversations about being a good Samaritan. And we're going to be talking about, frankly, how you can encourage all of us, encourage the church to be better good Samaritans in this area of racial unity. But I'm going to start with a video or a photo that I saw of you at the NRB conference, National Religious Broadcasters Conference, in 1986. So, I mean, even today, we sort of think of NRB as kind of this old, stodgy, white guy kind of conference. What the heck was NRB like in 1986?
Well, that takes me back a little bit. I felt very young then. Everybody seemed a lot older than me back in that. It was the first opportunity I had to speak to that convention. So it was a little, we weren't fully on radio at that point. We were hoping to be able to get on some radio stations. That speech really opened up doors for us.
Yeah, for sure.
So it was an exciting time, a challenging time, and we've seen many changes over the years.
Did you feel unique at NRB in 1986 as an African-American pastor? How did that play out in your experience?
Well, I was unique because there were not many African-American broadcasters. There were not many African-American attendees. And the reality is there weren't many African-American opportunities. One of the systemic issues was that whites were very leery to have African-Americans on their network because of their listenership. So that was a reality that had hindered much of a Black presence.
Yeah. So you've been a groundbreaker, frankly, sort of paving ground, breaking ground in this area of, helping the church kind of get its act together with respect to racial unity and inclusion for a long, long time.
Well, yeah, it's kind of fallen at my feet, I guess, given the social structure, the social distancing of the church, the spiritual distancing of the church, I'd call it. And however I can advance God's kingdom through addressing it biblically is certainly what I want to do.
So, Dan, we got to ask Dr. Evans about Mark Cuban, though, before we go any further.
Yeah.
So, Dr. Evans, I'm an Indiana University grad. Mark Cuban's one of our, celebrities that's graduated from Indiana University as well. We've had Beth Guckenberger from Back to Back Ministries on. She's from Indiana University. Other guests. Give us a little bit of insight as to what it's like to be the chaplain for the Dallas Mavericks, and do you have any funny Mark Cuban stories?
Well, I haven't gotten to know him that well. Know him a little bit. Whenever I went into locker room to do the chaplain, he would be on the stair stepper, working out. We talked for a few moments, and so he's very very vocal, very animated, and he's on the sideline. I mean,
right.
On the sideline, not an owner on the side. And, he's this next generation kind of owner. So he's cool with his ownership. So so it's been fun seeing him win a national championship. And
right. Yeah.
All the changes that have taken place with coaches and players and all of that, and being able to have a spiritual impact on the lives of some of the guys. So it's awesome.
That's
cool.
Awesome. That's really cool.
Well, let's dive into this area, Dr. Evans, that we are really looking for your wisdom on, which is the role of the church and the role of the individual. And I'm actually not going to say much more about this because you sort of have a methodology when you talk about this. I watched your video in late May. It's on YouTube. So for all of our listeners, you got to go to YouTube. It's called Dr. Tony Evans Speaks from His Heart About Social Injustice. And I think, Dr. Evans, you actually recorded this before one of your Sunday services, your Sunday sermons. And it's a 14-minute video. Again, all of our listeners, you got to go see it because it is so wise and you kind of don't hold back really in any area. So I want to unpack maybe that video a little bit. The first thing that you said was we are in the midst of a global medical pandemic, but you also say that we're experiencing a culture pandemic and a spiritual pandemic. What did you mean by that?
Well, 2 Chronicles 15, 3-6 says that there was no peace in those days to individuals, to families, to churches, or to nations. And then it says that God troubled them with every kind of distress. Now, if God is your problem, it kind of doesn't matter who you elect or what programs you come up with. Until you assuage what has caused him to allow the distress, you're going to still be in that distress. So all these other pandemics are really reflective of a spiritual pandemic. And so until we address the spiritual, the social, the physical, the economic, the racial, the cultural, cannot be properly and fully addressed. The best you can hope for is a Band-Aid.
That's good.
Yeah.
That's good. You have, I don't know if I should call it a methodology. You may want to correct me with my terminology, but tell us about the kingdom agenda, because you basically say there are 4 components to the problem of racial injustice and the solution to racial injustice. I think you would put that all in the kingdom agenda. Is that right?
Well, the kingdom agenda is the worldview. It's the worldview of our ministry, both locally and nationally through the Urban Alternative. The kingdom agenda is the visible manifestation of the comprehensive rule of God over every area of life. God has broken life down into 4 categories: the individual, the family, the church, and the government, civil society.
Yeah.
Is how those 4 areas are related to God and one another that will determine how ordered society will be. When those 4 areas and their relationship to him and one another are broken down, then that space is filled with disorder and discontinuity. Because individuals no longer take God seriously, the Bible calls it fearing God, because families are being redefined by culture rather than God, because the church has abandoned its kingdom responsibility, because the church was never meant to exist for the church. The church was meant to exist for the kingdom, according to chapter 16, verses 18 and 19. And because civil government has wandered so far from God's definition of government and has created its own definition of government, it has exited God's direct involvement in the well-being of society. Once God has been exited due to this idolatry on all 4 of those levels, then you get the personal and cultural repercussions of his absenteeism. Until there is a reversal of those led by God's people, predominantly the church, we will not heal this divide. The reason why we have this racial divide really can be traced back to the failure of the church, because what the church did was it became a co-conspirator to injustice and the racial divide by giving it theological and religious sanction. When it gave theological and religious sanction in slavery and Jim Crow, and either by actively endorsing it or passively not speaking out against it, then what it did was allow the social structures of society and the legal structures of society to operate based on it. And when they did, and the church was silent, then it added to the division that we're seeing erupting before us today.
Wow, that's good. I don't want to let the church off the hook. We've got a lot to talk about with respect to the church. A couple of questions come to mind. You sort of say, and I remember we held kind of a prayer service at Giving Company after the death of George Floyd, as everybody was trying to process it. And one of the things that I said during my prayer time is, hey, I have to do better. The log is in my eye. We have to start as individuals. And I think that's a little part of kind of your kingdom agenda approach. And it seems to me that to some extent, we have a lot of talking and a lot of tweeting and a lot of arguing. And you mentioned that good protesting is good. So I certainly don't want to say that the protesting has been bad. But how do we solve the individual piece of this? Because I think you and I would agree that it does start with the individual.
Martin Luther King said it best when he said that we need to judge people by the content of their character, not the color of their skin. Acts 17:26, God only has really one human race. He has a whole bunch of ethnicities, all the way going back from Noah's 3 sons that were different colors. And then you have in eternity, John saying, he says people from every nation, kindred, tongue, tribe. He could see the differences. So there was always be a variety of people groups and racial groups in history. But the individual must look at people's character. They must start where God starts. He always starts with the spirit. Then he moves to the soul. The body is last. According to 1 Thessalonians 5:23, God works with people from the spirit, soul, and body, not the body, soul, and spirit. And so if we start with the inner man and work to the outer man, we'll be going in the same direction God is going in. The other thing that an individual can do is build relationships with somebody different than you, and the two of you serve somebody else worse off than you. Yeah. Because they're having reconciliation through service, not because you had a racial seminar. That's where the Good Samaritan comes in. Because the Good Samaritan is serving. He's not just discussing racial differences. And when we get into a serving mentality rather than a seminar mentality, then we can see the fruit of racial reconciliation in a functional manner, not a theoretical one.
Yeah, that's great. I love the reconciliation through service. I think we got introduced as iDisciple to the urban alternative through Lee Jenkins, many years ago. And I know you all are close and know each other well. And he really is a proponent of relationships across races. And a lot of times I think you have people saying, well, get the white people out of it or whatever. And he's actually encouraging, no, let's have as many relationships across the racial divide as possible.
Well, absolutely, because as Ephesians 2 says, God is after creating one new man. He was bringing people together, not keeping them apart. Ephesians 4:3 says, you preserve the unity of the Spirit. In fact, the theology of unity is critical right now. Unity is oneness of purpose, not uniformity of persons. And God's glory, John 17:24, will only be manifested in biblical unity. So when Satan is able to keep us illegitimately disunified, we keep God's glory at bay, and we can pray all we want. We can have all the meetings we want. He will not let his unified person be comfortable in a disunified environment.
Yeah. That's good.
Yeah,
that's good.
We previously had Lee Jenkins on the podcast, and he talked to us about, talks that he's had with his children and sons about growing up Black. And, I shared similar experiences with my father. He had talks to me about growing up Latino and just like kind of knowing the environment that you're in and the world, what it's like for you. So what kind of conversations have you had with your kids about growing up as a minority in the United States?
Well, we've had the talk, which is the colloquial expression for giving our kids, particularly our boys, guidance in an unjust world, because in an unjust society. I've been pulled over by police simply because I was Black, wanting to know why I was driving in that neighborhood. I know what it is to have to counsel some of our members through clearly unjust situations, and I tell them, I give them a biblical foundation for how you communicate with those who are in authority. They have the badge, they have the blue uniform, and they have the law. Okay. In addition to that, they have the gun. So what you want to do is you want to respect their position, and you go overboard to do that. Why? Because God tells you to, number one, and because it's wise to, number two, because you always want to live to be able to make your argument another day. And since we do know there is that tiny group of officers who do not have affinity for African Americans, you do not want to incite something. Better to take the penalty, even if it's unjust, to be able to state your case later than to cause a conflict that could be disruptive. So we teach them their identity as in Christ first, and then as an African American, we teach them the reality of the world in which we live. Mm-hmm. I teach them to be respectful, put both of your hands on that steering wheel, and you make sure you do not do anything that exacerbates the situation, because people have been known to do that as well. And then you bring it back up to us so that we can walk with you through whatever has to be walked through in that situation. It is unfortunate It is unfortunate that the mere color of your skin can put you at an extra disadvantage. But that is the real world in which we live in far too many instances. But neither should that be used as an excuse for irresponsible behavior.
You know, Dr. Evans, there's a couple of comments that I want our listeners to sort of lean into, because I do think to some extent it can help the conversation. I, as a white man in America, never had to have the talk. And I think that's just one basic difference, that we can say we can do better trying to understand the plight of our Black brothers and sisters in this country, just from that basic difference. We can rattle off all the statistics of arrest rates and the prison sentence durations and all of those statistics, but you can boil it down to almost that one thing that means something to every individual, at least every parent, which is, I didn't have to have the talk. And Dan did as a Latino, and you did in your family. And I think we can all embrace that and say, okay, that's a really good indication that it can be different, unfortunately, based on the color of your skin in this country.
Yes, when the word white privilege is used, which is talking about the fact that Anglos have never had their color work against them. Yeah. It does not mean Anglos can't be poor, Anglos can't be disadvantaged. It means that their color, skin color, was never an impediment to their progress. And that's what should be meant by it, even though it gets conflated into other things, which
it's really good.
So that's a simple way of saying it. When it said Black Lives Matter as an emphasis, not as an entity, that's a whole different ballgame, but as an emphasis, it's like my 4 children. I have 4 children. I love them all. But if one child is going through some pain, some hurts, some struggles that is been incorporated into their history, that child's circumstance matters, not at the expense of the other 3, but because of their historical realities, I got to give them some extra attention. That's what evangelicalism has done with the life of the unborn. Abortion,
right. Yep.
Giving the unborn extra attention because of what's happening in the womb through abortion. So we're not saying the other lives don't matter. We're saying this situation needs special attention. Well, the history in America of racism, of some disadvantages, of some circumstances and systems, I would not have been able to go to Dallas Seminary a few years before I applied. They wouldn't accept Blacks. If it wasn't for James Dobson, I wouldn't be on the radio from the human point of view, because he had to intervene because white stations were not accepting black speakers. So on and on and on and on. There were structures in place that created disadvantages. And because this reality has been there, extra attention is appropriate. Extra empathy is appropriate. We do not compromise truth, but we do mix truth with love, because those two are to be partners in healing and help. And when you show empathy while you are loving and correcting things that need to be corrected, then we're making progress. When you think that there is no reason for empathy, then people, even if you're speaking truth, don't feel you care. And so marrying those two biblical concepts is what is critical. What we have often done in evangelicalism is like the Good Samaritan. We've come from the temple. We've come from the church, which is located in Jerusalem. We're on the Jericho Road. We may have our Bibles tucked under our arms, but we don't see the suffering that has occurred along the way. Yeah. And simply pausing for the suffering that's occurred along the way, particularly by the church, will go a long way to healing the wounds that are present in the African-American community and brown communities in particular.
So, Dr. Evans, you have very succinctly and very clearly and very easy to understand hit a couple I'm doing air quotes now for everybody on the podcast, sensitive topics, white privilege and Black Lives Matter. And you did it in a way that where it all makes sense. We can all act upon it. We can all understand it. So let's go to the next, sort of tough one, which is the church. And I probably do this unfairly, but when people say, that the church was silent during the 60s, the Jim Crow era, I say, and I mean this sincerely, well, the Black church wasn't silent, right? But we can't let the white church off the hook. Can you help us, just the way you did with white privilege and Black Lives Matter, help us put that into context so that the white church or the church can mobilize in a much more productive way than we have in the past?
Right. What the white church did was it sanctioned injustice. It sanctioned slavery in one of two ways. It gave theological validity to it. The curse of Ham, slavery in the Old Testament was used, that is, with the exception of Exodus 21:16, which says if you kidnapped somebody, made them a slave, and then sold them, that was capital punishment for the person who did that.
I forgot that part, right? Yeah.
Preaching that would have ended slavery. Right? It sanctioned that, or it was silence about it. So God had to bring judgment to America. It was called the Civil War. That was divine judgment on the failure of the church to deal with the sin of racism that it had sanctioned in the culture, implicitly or explicitly. So in the Jim Crow era, in the South in particular, it was silent about the evil of segregation. Not only segregation in the culture, but it was segregation in the church. I was in Atlanta, and Colonial Hills Baptist Church, one of the leading evangelical churches in East Point, Georgia, let it be known to me I could not come to that church because of the color of my skin. And so that was, in the late 60s. So the church was sanctioning it. That led to the split in the Southern Baptist Convention in 1845 between the Northern and the Southern Baptist Convention, who wanted to keep slavery. So when God is okaying it, when a mist in the pulpit becomes a fog in the pew. So the people are okaying it. The people are living with it, thinking that it's okay with God, when it wasn't. And so it became theologically, spiritually, evangelically sanctioned. And that spirit infiltrated the culture and allowed it to become a progenitor of disunity. Now, the church that cooperated in the virus, so you sense virus is a big word right now, in the virus that infiltrated the culture with regard to injustice, needs to be the leading institution to rectify it. And God is waiting on the church. Now, I know we're waiting on God, but God is actually waiting on us, because in 2 Chronicles, again, 15:3-6, it says, in their distress, they got back right with God, and then God allowed himself to be found and to bring healing to the land. The church has to understand that the church does not exist for the church exists for the kingdom, and the kingdom is bigger than the church. It's God's comprehensive rule. On our website, tonyevans.org, we have a 3-part plan for how the church can lead in solving this cultural crisis and racial pandemic we're now experiencing. Number 1, in every community in America, every local area, if the evangelically kingdom-minded churches would come together across racial lines, and the pastors would come together, they pray together every month, but then annually they have a solemn assembly, a sacred gathering, to call God's people together as one in their local community, okay? Then out of that sacred gathering, they speak with one voice about the major issues affecting that community: racial injustice, abortion, whatever the major issues are where the Bible is inextricably clear. Then the third thing is they do good works together, like adopting every public school in their community and providing mentoring and family support services to the at-risk students. A black and white church adopting the same school. The principle is reconciliation through service, not just through seminars. Or adopting the local police precinct and being the bridge between the community and the police because of the division that is there. Then economic development, so that the church becomes the major place for job training, job placement, job hiring, and economic development. Adopting the homeless families in their community. So when you do those things together, they cannot argue Matthew 5:16 against our good works. And we're letting our light shine, opening up an opportunity for the gospel. One of the problems is that the church has not understood the difference between the content of the gospel and the scope of the gospel. The content is narrow, faith alone in Christ alone, for the gift of eternal life. But the scope is very broad. Jesus said in Luke 4 that the scope is for the poor, for the oppressed, and for the year of Jubilee, because that's what the acceptable year of the Lord was. When we marry the content that gets you to heaven with the scope that brings heaven to earth, then we will have a gospel that people can see works in the day-to-day, not the sweet by and by, but also the nasty here and now. And unless the church takes the lead in unity, then the culture cannot see what this solution looks like. And so the urban alternative facilitates this in communities around the country, because every community can do that, and we'll have a national movement tied to a local model.
Outstanding.
That's good. Dr. Tony, we were fortunate enough to put 4 of your growth plans, otherwise known as reading plans, on the iDisciple platform. I'd like to ask your comments on about 2 of them. The first one is the power of unity, and the second one is the role of the church in cultural clashes.
Well, the power of unity is really cited clearly in Jesus' high priestly prayer in John 17. He says, I pray that they are one like we are one. So you have to ask the theological question, how is God one? Well, we believe in one God composed of 3 co-equal persons who are distinct in personality while being one in essence. Like a pretzel with 3 holes. The first hole is not the second hole is not the third hole, but they're all 3 tied together by the same dough because they all bear divine nature. He says, I want the church to be like we are. Now, the reason why that's critical is God's unified being is not free to function in a disunified environment. That even affects the family. God told the husband that his prayers will be hindered if he's not treating his wife right. So if you're not treating your wife right, don't bother to pray because I'm not listening. Because God can only be himself when he can be himself. And that is a unified being, which explains why Paul tells us in Romans 16, to mark those who cause division among you, because what they're doing is exiting God from the premises of the church. So unfortunately, God has been exited from many churches because of their racism and injustice. So let them be one as we are one. When he says we are one, he says Jesus Christ will be magnified. In verse 24 of John 17 says, and the glory of God will be revealed. The glory of God is the visible manifestation of his attributes. And we need his attribute of justice and mercy and peace and righteousness to be manifested in our midst. But he's got to see unity before he's free to perform it. So we have actually held God at bay by our disunity. Unity is not an option. God will actually create this unity. Isn't that what he did with the Tower of Babel? In Genesis chapter 11, he said, y'all want to be unified without me? No way, Jose. He says that's not going to happen. And he disunified them because they wanted independence apart from him. And he says, I'm not going to allow that to happen in the culture. And so he says, if I don't do it, then they will become unstoppable, because unity is a powerful thing when God said, let them rule. So he will abide by our decision to leave him out or to bring him in, because he's decided to honor our free will up to the point of his sovereign control. And so now the role of the church in the culture is to become the conscience of the culture, including the conscience of government. There was a time when there was a Christian consensus in the culture, for the most part. It wasn't perfect, or we wouldn't have had the injustice of racism. But it was real. That's why you could have abolition. That's why we could appeal to the Constitution, because there was a Judeo-Christian consensus. Well, that consensus is no longer the case. We are no longer the home team. We are the visiting team, because we do not have cultural support or cultural consensus. And that is because of our failure to be influential in the culture. So we are to now be salt and light, reignite our presence in the culture to bring God's divine point of view to the culture, so that the culture can now see what God's kingdom principles, supported by God's Holy Spirit power can do in bringing order to a chaotic world. As long as we are hemmed up in our churches, as long as we're huddles in a football game, rather than breaking huddle and scoring touchdowns on the field of play while being opposed by the opposition, the crowd can't see, because the crowd doesn't see what's happening in the huddle. That's a private play. That's what happens in our churches. We call private plays every Sunday when we need public execution so the people can see what God looks like when he scores touchdowns through his people who are advancing his kingdom based on plays called from heaven.
That's good. So, Dr. Evans, I mentioned this to Lee Jenkins as well. You know, our listeners are fortunate because they can hear this podcast. I attend Eagle's Nest Church in Alpharetta, Roswell, Georgia, to hear Lee Jenkins. What do you do? You know, what would be your advice to our listeners when we don't have Dr. Evans at our disposal? We don't have Lee Jenkins at our disposal. How do believers in this country who may have had the log in their own eye, as we've talked about, may not have gotten it right, may not have listened well, may not have understood well, may have been complicit, not intentionally. Can you give maybe some advice, because we only have you for a few more minutes, on if I can't pick up the phone and call Dr. Evans, if I can't text Lee Jenkins, what do I do? How do I stay on track here?
Well, I wrote a book called Oneness Embraced, and that kind of goes through this and principalizes it and tries to discuss it, always centered in scripture, but also tying some historical and cultural realities to it. So that's a tool. I know many churches are taking, and Christians are reading it and taking their people through it, and the video series to go with it. So that's a tool. Other Christians have written, look for books that can help you understand and empathize better with the history of racial divide. Then secondly, build relationships. You can do that on an individual level. You can have your family, get to know another family that's different than you, but can share some experiences so you can empathize with them and what they've experienced that you may not have experienced. And then speak up. When you see things that are wrong, George Floyd was wrong. Everybody agrees that it was wrong. Okay, that ought to not just be felt; it ought to be verbalized in your sphere of influence. Yeah. So speak up and don't be silent. Speak with love, but also speak with clarity. There shouldn't be an uncertain sound. Then make sure that you are involved with your church, to whatever extent your church is involved, in reaching out and partnering and doing ministry to those who are the least of these, so that people see your heart and feel it. And then in the culture, make sure that you are promoting those things that not only produce righteousness in the womb, but justice to the tomb. Be involved in those things that promote justice as vehemently as we are involved in those things that produce righteousness. Let the world see what the church can do in the marketplace of ideas, when the school teacher, when the doctor, when the lawyer, when the judge, when the housewife, when they all are reflecting kingdom values in the public square, not only in the privacy of our Christian community.
That's good. Well, one of the things that I will definitely take away, Dr. Evans, from both your video on YouTube and this conversation is Psalm 89:14. I just think that's so enlightening and can help guide our steps.
Well, thank you. This is a challenging time, but God has opened up for us a door of opportunity. I sure hope Christians in the church doesn't skip walking through this door.
Yeah, that's good. That's good. Hey, as we close, Dr. Evans, I was able to get my hands on your ebook, A Personal Challenge to Black and White Americans, from Dr. Tony Evans. I mentioned in your introduction that you've written over 100 books, Bible studies, articles. You have a lot of content that can be very helpful in what I will call, unfortunately, still a tough issue, right, for individuals. I think I can say that. But you've got all these helpful materials. Can you maybe help our listeners understand where they can go to follow you, get more information, connect with you, continue to learn from you?
All you have to do is go on tonyevans.org. That's the website for the Urban Alternative, tonyevans.org. All of our material, all of our information, all of our videos, all of our teachings, all of our books, they're right on that website. So one-stop shop, tonyevans.org. You can also get our app. We have an app where we teach every day, and you can get our messages every day from the app. But all that information is on tonyevans.org.
That's awesome. Well, honestly, just like the role of the church in cultural clashes, white privilege, Black Lives Matter, tonyevans.org. You've made it easy. You've made it simple. You've made it clear. We are just so thankful, Dr. Evans, not just for your time today, but for your leadership, your voice, and your impact. And I truly just hope everyone will heed your wisdom and your words, because I think the country will certainly wind up a better place.
Well, thank you very much. We're honored to be your friends in ministry, and we look forward to what God's going to do.
Thank you.
Awesome. Dan, any final words from you, bud?
Just thank you, man. Appreciate you coming on and bearing with us during these COVID times and making it all happen.
Well, thank you. Sorry for the freezing.
No problem.
Yeah, no problem, Dr. Evans. You and the church, the Oak Cliff Bible Fellowship, the Urban Alternative, your team there, Heather, and everybody. I hope you guys stay safe and stay healthy. We're praying for you. To all of our listeners, it has just been a joy to be with Dr. Tony Evans today on the Walking Through Samaria podcast. Dan, always good to be with you, even though it's virtual, buddy.
Yep, always.
We'll talk to everybody next time. Thanks so much for tuning in on the Walking Through Samaria podcast.
Thanks, guys. For more content like this, visit us at givingcompany.com. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next time on Walking Through Samaria.